It was an afternoon heavy with silence. Oxford wrapped in damp air and red leaves drifting like secrets. A man named Gregory Vale, retired academic, had just died in a fire at Bellmakers College. But before the flames, they say, he smiled. And that smile, more than the fire itself, is where our mystery begins. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? It was the kind of afternoon that made one think about resignation, a sullen sort of beauty, where the city breathes through its dampness and the world seems to bruise a little earlier than it should. Outside my window, red leaves slid down in lazy spirals, drifting as though even gravity had grown contemplative. I remember watching one of them hesitate mid-air, caught in the eddy of an unseen current, then finally commit to the fall. Banbury Road, silent as confession, waited beneath. The crossword stared up at me. Unfinished, of course. I had 4 clues left, all stubborn and likely misdirected. Someone at the Times had been in a cruel sort of mood. 4 down, final echo of firelight in retreat. 6. I had tried embers, but it didn't sit right. Too obvious. The answer was always less about the definition and more about the turning of it, the play between sense and suggestion. My glass, half full of indifferent scotch, held no answers. Nor did the book I had not touched or the conversation I had not had. Dr. Caroline Lenton, philosophy fellow at St. Hilda's, had offered me the beginnings of something last week. Not romance, nothing so dramatic. A kind of truce, perhaps, a shared sentence in the long novel of solitude. I had declined without saying no. That's something I've become rather adept at over the years, letting things fade without the grace of finality. The echo of the door as she left had been louder than her footsteps. Below, the newsagent coughed once, his way of announcing something. He was always listening to the radio, not for news, but for the possibility of it. His voice reached me faintly through the floorboards. Fire at Bellmakers College. Old lodge house gone. Man inside. Smiled before it started. A flick of static. Silence. I didn't move. Not at first. I sat, glass in hand, leaf still suspended in memory, and tried to feel something that wasn't simply routine. Bellmakers College. One of the smaller enclaves of academic stubbornness. An old lodge house, crumbling even when I first walked past it 20 years ago, now apparently reduced to cinders and a corpse. The man who lived there had smiled, apparently. Before the fire began. That stayed with me. Not the fire, not the death. Those were almost municipal, like broken drains or a toppled bicycle in the rain. But the smile. What could provoke it? There's something inherently un-British about smiling into destruction. We tend to frown, mutter, or make a cup of tea. Smiles belong to satisfaction, irony, or secrets. I rose slowly, the creak of the armchair sounding, like an apology. The crossword was left unfinished. The glass, still half full, marked my absence with the faintest ripple. My coat, damp from yesterday's drizzle, lay folded over the banister. I took it as one might take up an old argument. The walk to the lodge wasn't long. Oxford doesn't change as much as it layers. One decade placed gently atop another. As I passed under the arch near St. Giles, I could still smell the ghost of last week's rain. A bell tolled somewhere behind me, a sound too heavy for its own purpose. When I reached the edge of Bellmakers, the fire brigade had already left. Only a low, embarrassed hiss came from the blackened timbers, like the building was ashamed of what it had revealed. No crowds. Just a constable with 2 short trousers and a clipboard he didn't know what to do with. He nodded. I nodded. That was the extent of our ceremony. I asked, eventually, who had died. He checked his sheet as though uncertain. Gregory Vale. Retired academic. No immediate family. Lived alone. Had his groceries delivered weekly, always paid by check. I asked if he had suffered. The constable glanced up. They say he'd been smiling. I stepped closer to the ruin. The window frames had melted inward like expressions recoiling from something. One chimney still stood, faintly ridiculous in its insistence. The scent was not entirely unpleasant. Burnt paper, damp ash, and the faint tang of something floral, perhaps from a curtain or a rug that once belonged to someone's grandmother. I don't believe in signs, but I do believe in details, and something about that smile, reported casually by a man who didn't know how to lie, troubled me in the way only truth can. Gregory Vale had smiled before the fire began, and I, as always, arrived too late for the moment that mattered. They had roped the place off with a kind of weary efficiency. 2 lengths of plastic tape, fluttering faintly in the wind like the idea of caution rather than its enforcement. The smell hit first. Not the acrid fury of flames, but the soft, defeated residue of something once whole. Charcoal and damp wood. Paper that had tried to speak and failed. I stood at the threshold longer than I should have. Coat collar turned up not from cold, but from something more private. There's always a hesitation before entering someone else's ruin. The lodge house, or what remained of it, had not been built to withstand scrutiny. The roof had collapsed inward like a thought interrupted mid-sentence. The furniture, what little of it hadn't been reduced to illegible smears, now sulked in corners. Blackened outlines of what once offered comfort, and in the center, the hearth where the fire had begun, a pile of ash that had been a man. Gregory Vale. A name that hadn't surfaced in conversation for years, and even then, only in the sort of footnote reserved for men who had not failed spectacularly, only quietly. He had once taught Milton, or was it Donne? Something poetic, something that allowed ambiguity to masquerade as profundity. There had been a quiet scandal, the details of which had slipped through the cracks of memory. A paper withdrawn, a grant revoked, a woman's name murmured in the senior common room, then not at all. I circled the wreckage without speaking. No one accompanied me. Lewis had taken the day to visit his cousin in Devon, and I had not requested a replacement. I preferred the solitude. The fire brigade had left their report on the desk. Or rather, the slab of timber that had once served as one. Faulty wiring, most likely. A spark behind the bookshelf. Old insulation. I read the words twice and believed none of them. It was the bookshelf that bothered me. 1 row of books, old hardbacks with cracked spines and dust jackets long since gone to history, had burned unevenly. The top shelves had disintegrated, curling into themselves like exhausted petals, but the middle remained oddly intact, scorched at the edges, yet still legible. The Anatomy of Melancholy sat beside collected Yeats. A volume of Mallarmé was slightly open, page warped but untouched, as though the fire had hesitated there, uncertain whether to continue. Then there was the teacup, white porcelain, thin-lipped, unchipped. It stood on the desk, precisely centered, gleaming with an insolence that felt deliberate. The saucer was absent. No trace of liquid, no staining. Just the cup, absurdly clean in a room that had forgotten what cleanliness was. It might have been washed yesterday. It might never have been used. I crouched beside it without touching. In my head, the crossword returned. 4 down. Final echo of firelight in retreat. 6. I tried glower this time. Still wrong. A constable appeared behind me, clearing his throat in a manner both polite and unnecessary. He handed over a thin manila folder. Inside, the coroner's early notes. Preliminary, tentative, bureaucratically careful. Death by smoke inhalation. Body had been found seated. No signs of struggle. No wounds. Possible sedative presence in the bloodstream, pending toxicology. I thanked him with a nod, and he vanished as quietly as he'd arrived. It was as if the building swallowed sound now. I stepped into the back room. The walls here had fared worse. plaster peeled in long, curling ribbons, as if the house were trying to unright itself. A mirror had cracked diagonally, splitting the reflection into two disagreeing halves. On a shelf near the corner sat a brass-framed photograph, face down. I turned it gently. A woman, unsmiling, in formal robes, early 70s by the cut of her hair. Vale stood beside her, younger, heavier, eyes distracted. They weren't touching, but the picture had been kept. Back in the main room, the teacup still gleamed. It hadn't cracked in the heat. That, more than anything, unnerved me. Not the fire, not the death, but this small defiance of logic. A man dies, surrounded by flame, and a single porcelain cup is left immaculate. No enemies, they said. No family, but even ghosts have teeth. I stared at the cup for a long time. Then, quietly, I asked the question no one else had. Why had he been smiling? Bellmakers College has always reminded me of a sentence left unfinished. A little too short, a little too enclosed. The architecture lacked the vaulting ambition of the older institutions, but made up for it with a kind of quiet, clerical severity. You don't arrive at Bellmakers so much as descend into it, through gates that never quite close and corridors that smell faintly of old tea and floor polish. Even the ivy seemed tentative. Dr. Alice Harron received me with the kind of stillness that suggested her time was not to be wasted, but might, if required, be endured. She was young, perhaps early 30s, but had already acquired the unmoved poise of someone who had read deeply and cared selectively. Hair drawn back into something too symmetrical to be called severe. A voice like cool stone, level and dry. She gestured toward the chair opposite her desk with a precision that excluded warmth. I sat. She did not. Her hands remained folded in front of her, one thumb gently circling the other, in a movement so slow I might have missed it had the room been less spare. I asked about Vale. She said he had been lonely, certainly. Fond of red wine, unreliable with his citations, and, in later years, prone to peculiarities that didn't always find room in committee agendas. A man out of time, she called him. When I asked if they had been close, she gave the faintest tilt of the head, the kind that implies something between obligation and regret. We worked together, briefly. Years ago. He gave a few lectures on 17th century elegy. Students found him difficult to follow. He had the sort of mind that folded in on itself, and in his final months, he became, she said, a little strange. Quietly. So, he mentioned once or twice that someone was attempting to alter the record, to rewrite things, as he put it. I assumed he meant the departmental archive. Or perhaps an old thesis. He wouldn't be the first. She didn't laugh, not exactly. But something in the shape of her mouth suggested that laughter was a language she could speak if ever pressed. I watched the way she touched a paperweight on the desk. Just once, fingers brushing against the glass dome as though confirming it remained there. I asked if Vale had any visitors. None that she knew of. He had withdrawn, as some academics do, into a private canon of his own making. He was harmless. Sad, perhaps, but harmless. There were no books in her office. That struck me more than anything. A desk, 2 chairs, 1 steel filing cabinet, and a small framed print of a woodcut, Blake or possibly Flaxman. The shelves behind her were bare, save for 1 volume that sat too prominently on the otherwise naked surface. Don's Devotions upon Emergent Occasions. The 1941 Clarendon edition, the sort of book chosen less for its content than its weight. I reached for it idly, and she did not stop me. Inside, a dedication in careful italic hand. For the silence between bells, when nothing means more than it says. It was attributed to Don, but the phrasing was wrong. Don never wrote those words. I knew them, They were from a student essay I'd marked a decade ago. Brilliant, deeply flawed, and utterly unforgettable. I said nothing. Instead, I returned the book to its place and asked whether she'd attended Vale's last lecture. Number. She hadn't. Did she remember what it was about? She thought for a moment. Memory, she said, and the impossibility of truly recording it. He was fond of that theme. He once told her that the past was safest when half misremembered. I asked if she believed that. She smiled, or perhaps didn't. Her face flickered for the briefest second, like a light behind curtains that never quite part. As I left, I noted the clock in the corridor had stopped at 3:17. It might have meant nothing, but time, like people, rarely stops without reason. Outside, the sky had turned the color of tarnished pewter. I stood for a moment, coat unbuttoned, letting the wind carry the scent of distant fires. I thought of that teacup again, of the smile, and of a misquoted poet sitting alone on an otherwise empty shelf. The air in Vale's office still carried the faint, bitter trace of something charred and ancient. Not smoke, not quite, but the ghost of books burned reluctantly. Most of the room had been claimed by soot and silence, yet I kept returning. The fire had devoured the obvious, but not everything. Ashes don't lie, but they often conceal. I had come to look again at the shelving. The odd survival of that middle row still nagged at me, but instead found myself staring at the filing cabinet near the window. It was tilted, as though shifted during the fire, its left rear leg slightly warped. One drawer, half open, revealed a scatter of yellowed departmental notices and a program for a lecture on Sir Thomas Browne, dated 1982, with Vale's name faintly penciled in as chair. A man who once presided, then quietly disappeared from the minutes. Something behind the drawer caught my eye. A corner of glossy paper curled slightly with heat. I eased the cabinet forward, careful not to upset what little structure remained, and retrieved it. A photograph, color-washed by time. 5 figures. Summer robes, postprandial smiles, a collegiate garden just visible in the background. I recognized Vale instantly. Thinner then, but already carrying that slight downturn of the mouth that suggested either wisdom or weariness. Beside him, unmistakably, was a much younger Alice Harron. Her hair was looser, her expression less guarded, but the posture, arms close to the body, chin slightly raised, was already in place. The third figure wore flamboyantly patterned trousers and a velvet scarf that hung with theatrical defiance. Nathan Lee, the theater tutor. I'd seen him once, years ago, directing the Duchess of Malfi with more attention to the costumes than the text. Beside him, a man in wire-rimmed glasses and a too-tight collar, Julian Bromes, then recently installed as bursar. He looked like he'd never quite forgiven himself for accepting the post. And then there was the student, Rosalind Kerr, barely 20. Her face held something unspeakably alive, like someone who hadn't yet realized she was being watched by history. She stood between Vale and Heron, but not close to either. One hand tucked behind her back, her gaze drifting slightly to the side, away from the lens. All 5 were smiling, but only Vale was looking directly at the camera. Behind them, the old chapel clock, its hands frozen almost elegantly at 3:17. I stared at that for longer than I care to admit. Details. Always the details. The photographer must have known or guessed. 3:17. Not midday. Not even a round hour. It meant something to someone. I folded the photo slowly and placed it in my coat pocket. Lewis appeared just as I was preparing to leave, carrying his usual reluctance in the way he stepped across the threshold. He handed me a folder, his expression unreadable. "Smoke inhalation," he said. "But something's off." There were sedatives in his system. Strong enough to dull, not to kill. Diazepam, likely taken within the hour before the fire. No sign of forced ingestion. He might have taken them himself. Might, I said, or someone gave them to him. Lewis didn't reply. Sometimes his silences are more helpful than his questions. I glanced once more around the office. The burnt spines, the ghost of a rug pattern, the single cup, all arranged almost politely around the absence of a man who had once spoken of memory as a necessary fiction. I said nothing more. Instead, I walked out into the corridor, past the grandfather clock, whose chime no longer worked, and toward the quad where a small group of students was rehearsing lines from a play I didn't recognize. One of them stumbled on a line, laughed, and started again. At the archway, I turned once, half hoping to hear the chapel bell, but there was only wind and the low sound of something being rehearsed that had already happened. The chapel bell had just finished its fifth chime as I made my way into the old theater building, a converted refectory with beams too low for comfort and dust that seemed rehearsed in its own right. I've always found rehearsal rooms to be strangely unsettling. Something about the pretending, the repetition, the masks worn too long. You begin to wonder what people do with the truth once they've finished borrowing its gestures. Nathan Lee was in the center of it all, naturally. A circle of undergraduates around him, most attempting iambic pentameter with the trembling bravado of children trying to walk in their parents' shoes. He corrected them gently, but with the faint, unshakable air of a man who believed the text would rather be in his mouth than theirs. Dr. Faustus. A bit too on the nose, I thought, for a college still dusting ash from its memory. He greeted me with a kind of theatrical warmth that doesn't quite touch the eyes. "Inspector," he said, "I was just teaching them how to sell their souls with proper articulation." He offered a seat that wasn't really a seat, a broken prop throne missing one armrest. I stayed standing. I asked him about Gregory Vale. He didn't hesitate. Gregory was already burning long before the fire, he said. He lit his own kindling in the end. I asked him to explain. He smiled, slowly, as if pulling a thought from a drawer he rarely opened. "There was a girl," he said. "Years ago. Rosalind Kerr. Bright. Alarmingly so. She had that unnerving clarity some students arrive with, the sort that makes you feel like they're borrowing time. She read Marlowe in translation, even though she didn't need to. Vale adored her, claimed he was mentoring her, but I always thought she was the one leading him somewhere. I asked what happened. "She drowned," he said. "Summer of '76. In the ISIS. There was an inquiry, naturally. These things always have to be made tidy. The college brushed it under the academic rug, which is quite a capacious thing when needed. Bromes signed off on the report. The conclusion was accidental death. She was found with a bruised temple. No one asked why, or if they did, they didn't ask twice." He turned then, distracted by a student fumbling a line about eternal damnation. He called out the correct phrasing, then turned back to me with an expression that didn't quite belong to the present moment. "Gregory never recovered," he said. "Not really. He stopped publishing. Stopped appearing at a high table. Just disappeared into smaller and smaller rooms. Eventually, only the lodge remained." I left without a formal goodbye. The smell of stage paint and candle wax was beginning to give me a headache. Outside, the clouds had formed a ceiling so low you felt you could reach up and smudge it with your palm. Bellmakers College doesn't keep its archives in any particular order. The departmental files are stored in a small annex beside the kitchen, a room that smells of onions and academic decay. I had to bribe the porter with a promise not to remove anything. The file was thin. 6 pages. Photocopied testimony. A brief medical report. A statement from Bromes that used the word unfortunate 4 times in 2 paragraphs. Rosalind Kerr, age 20, drowned during the long vacation. Alone. Time of death estimated between 4 and 6 p.m. Bruising noted on left temple, no sign of prolonged struggle. Alcohol not detected. Verdict, misadventure. The final page was signed by Bromes with a hand that looked like it had once been precise and now regretted it. I held the page to the light, as if that would reveal what was missing, but nothing appeared. Paper, like memory, rarely gives up more than it wants to. As I walked back through the quad, I passed a student reciting aloud from Faustus, alone. The wind caught her voice mid-verse. Was this the face that launched 1,000 ships? The phrase drifted, then fell, and I thought of Rosalind, of that bruised temple, of a mentor who stopped speaking and a bursar who signed what he didn't question. There is a silence that follows drowning. Some never surface from it. That evening, the crossword was blank. Not unfinished, blank, no clues, no grid numbers. Just squares, a pale sea of possibility. I must have printed it by accident, though I don't remember doing so. It sat there on the kitchen table like a challenge issued in silence. Solve this without direction. I stared at it for a long time. The white space seemed to expand, to hum faintly. Vale's past had felt much the same, all shape, no text. I had begun to imagine it as a kind of puzzle with missing instructions. A man dies in fire, smiling. A woman vanishes into water, bruised and unread. A bursar signs his name beneath silence. The pieces were drifting near each other, but nothing touched. The scotch in my glass had gone warm. I drank it anyway. There's a kind of virtue in bitterness if it's earned. I thought, without meaning to, of Alice Harron's office, of the book with the false attribution. Don misquoted, deliberately or otherwise. Of her silence when I asked about that final lecture. Of the chapel clock, always stopping at 3:17. Then the phone rang. I let it ring 3 times before I reached for it, as if doing so too quickly would admit I was waiting. Lewis's voice came across like gravel on a quiet road. He said he'd found something. Vale's bank records. Unremarkable mostly, until you reach the deposits. Same amount, same date. Every 6 months. For 15 years. Anonymous. But the account was held by a trust. Something tied, rather faintly, to Bellmakers College. Not an official disbursement. A private fund with academic trimmings. I asked the name of the trust. He read it aloud. I'd never heard of it, but I knew who would have. Julian Bromes received me in his usual apologetic tweed, blinking too much, breathing like a man perpetually surprised to still be alive. We sat in his office surrounded by ledgers that no one had touched since decimalization. I didn't press. I simply placed the printed line of Vale's deposits in front of him, and waited. He looked at the paper the way some men look at old photographs of mistakes they thought they'd buried. He said it wasn't college money. That was the first thing. He seemed eager to distinguish. Not college money, he said again. A private gift. Regular. No contact details. The donor had been a former student. Studied here in the 70s. He couldn't recall the name. It had come through a solicitor in London, always the same sum. No letters, just instructions. Support the welfare of Dr. Gregory Vale, in perpetuity. No disclosure to recipient. I asked when it started, a year after Rosalind Kerr died. Bromes rubbed his forehead with trembling fingers. He said he assumed it was guilt, or grief, or both. I asked if he ever thought to trace it. He said yes. Once. Then didn't. I didn't push further. There's a kind of cowardice that looks too much like mercy to scold. Outside, the quad was unusually still. The clouds hung like curtains half drawn. I heard someone playing Debussy faintly through a cracked window. Too slow, but earnest. When I returned home, the crossword was still on the table. Still blank, but now as I looked, one word suggested itself. Not from the grid, but from somewhere older. Cover. 5 letters. Too simple. Too neat. I wrote it anyway. The squares remained otherwise empty, but something had begun to move in the silence. The fire hadn't started with flame. It had started, I suspected, with an attempt to forget. It began with the smell. Not smoke this time, but its ghost. Faint, metallic, and apologetic, curling along the edges of the morning like something ashamed of having come back. The porter met me halfway across the quad, his face arranged into an expression of bureaucratic distress. Small fire in the archive building, contained quickly. No one hurt, but something was missing. One box. The room itself was more scorched than burned. A blackened patch along the lower shelving, charred papers curling like old petals, the air thick with the memory of heat. A narrow window had been forced open from the inside. A fire extinguisher lay spent on its side, foam staining the parquet floor. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical, except for the box. It had been listed in the handwritten index left pinned behind the filing cabinet. Kerr, R. Rosalind. Personal file. Restricted. Sealed, 1976. The kind of file that's never opened unless the dead refuse to stay dead. I ran a gloved finger along the edges of the remaining shelf. Dust interrupted by one clean square, exactly the shape of an archive box. Someone had known exactly what they were looking for. Lewis arrived 20 minutes later with that look he gets when the facts don't line up with the story. CCTV footage from the college gatehouse. Night before, just after midnight. One figure. No attempt to hide. No panic. Just a steady walk across the cloister and through the back door of the archive. The coat was what caught me. Long, black, belted, academic cut. Subtle detail along the collar. A faint twist like a ribbon stitched by regret. Dr. Alice Harron. We found her in her office, correcting examination scripts with the same precision she gave to everything else. She looked up, met my gaze with neither guilt nor surprise. I said we needed to speak about the archive. She closed her pen, said nothing. I asked where she'd been the night before. At home. Reading. Alone. I asked if she'd ever requested access to Rosalind Kerr's file. Never. And yet I said someone had taken it, and that someone had worn a coat remarkably similar to hers. Still nothing. Then I asked a different question. I asked when she last dreamt of Rosalind. There was a long pause. Her hands didn't move. Her eyes, so exact, so terribly composed, drifted somewhere to the right of my shoulder. She said she had been in love with her. The words came like a fragment of song overheard in the rain. Not a confession, not even a defense. Just the truth, dressed in silence. She had never told her, never written, never spoken, but watched, protected, judged. When Rosalind died, she said, something in her stopped. Not entirely, but enough. Vale had known, she said, or suspected. He said nothing to anyone. That was his way. The great noticer, the man who listened too much and spoke too late. I asked if she'd taken the file. She said she hadn't, but she understood why someone might want to. The coat, she said, wasn't unique. That was all. I didn't press. As we left, Lewis said she hadn't even flinched. I said she'd already burned years ago. Outside, the morning light was harsh, unsparing. The chapel clock read 3:17, still broken, still telling the hour of a death no one had grieved properly. I lit a cigarette I didn't want and let the smoke remind me of fire. Some stories don't end. They're carried. The box arrived in a folded brown paper bag, unlabeled, unsealed, untouched, the sort of parcel a porter might forget he was holding until someone reminded him why it mattered. It had been recovered from the edge of the fire, barely spared. Smoke stained around the corners, the lid warped but otherwise intact. The contents, as always, told more than they intended. Inside, a pair of reading glasses with one arm missing, a fountain pen half filled with iron gall ink, and a leather-bound notebook the color of dusk. No title, no name, just a narrow blue ribbon pressed between the pages like a whisper someone forgot to speak. I opened it on my kitchen table under the weight of the late hour. The notebook wasn't a diary. There were no dates, no entries in sequence, just poems, or the beginnings of them, all handwritten in Vale's tightly slanted script, each line balanced like a man walking a beam in fog. The first was titled Isis at Twilight. I read it twice before I noticed the pattern. The alternating capital letters, not at the start of words but embedded mid-line, sometimes in verbs, sometimes tucked into conjunctions like stowaways. At first, it looked like eccentricity, a failed attempt at rhythm. But when I pulled only the capitals, every second one left to right, it spelled a sentence. She fell, but I was pushed. I stared at the line for a long time. It wasn't confession, not quite. It wasn't clear whether he meant himself or someone else. The poem refused to clarify. She fell, but I was pushed. Grief, perhaps, or guilt refracted through memory. The rest of the notebook offered no key, but fragments clung to the edges. Recurring phrases, half-repeated metaphors, a distant sister, a bell without a rope. A line that read, "There are 4 who face the lens and 1 who guards the shadow." The photograph returned to mind. The summer garden, the 5 of them, the smiles arranged like furniture. Only Vale had looked at the camera. Harren had tilted her head. Bromes was squinting. Kerr looked past the lens, and Nathan Lee, I now remembered, had turned slightly away. The 5th face turned aside. I went back to the photo, unfolded it from its envelope like a letter I'd been avoiding. Lee's expression was curious, not evasive exactly, but not participating. His body angled just enough to miss the frame of memory, guarding the shadow. There were other phrases in the notebook, one that struck me in particular. The stage remembers what the script forgets. I thought of Lee and his production of Dr. Faustus, of his remark about Vale burning long before the fire. Another poem ended with a line scratched out until the page tore slightly. The words beneath were still legible in the right light. I did not hold her hand, but I did not turn away. The notebook seemed less like literature and more like the confession of someone uncertain whether he was the witness or the cause. I turned the pages slowly, searching not for clarity, but for the pattern behind the obfuscation. Vale hadn't written these for the world, perhaps not even for himself, but the way the phrases leaned into each other suggested purpose. The poems were loops, revisiting the same symbols, circling around the same wound. Drowning, bruising, silence, and always the number 5. I closed the book, let the room breathe again. The crossword on my desk remained unsolved. I wrote in one word, without knowing why. Angle, a reference point, a perspective, or the space between truth and memory. The fire had left Vale's body intact enough to sedate, but this notebook, felt like the final thing he meant anyone to see. I placed it beside the photograph, as if one might explain the other, but both remained quiet. Oxford slept on the other side of the glass, unaware or uninterested in its own history. I sat there, watching the words refuse to settle. Some truths arrive as riddles, some as poems no one was meant to finish. The theater was empty when I arrived. Not locked, just left. A kind of neglect particular to buildings that have seen too much performance. The scent met me first, a layered hush of dust, paint, dried wood, and a faint echo of forgotten applause. Even silence seems rehearsed in rooms like this. I didn't turn the house lights on. The dusk was enough. A pale wash of late light filtered through the high clerestory windows, catching the gold fringe of the main curtain in a way that made it look briefly alive. Velvet always ages dramatically. It sulks, it folds inward, it remembers every hand that's ever gripped it in a moment of theatrical panic. The rope was behind the left wing, tucked just out of sight, coiled, unlabeled, dry with age but not unused. Not a rigging line. Something older, heavier, slightly frayed at the midpoint, as if it had caught once. Not broken, just hesitated. I didn't touch it at first, just looked. The floor beneath was scuffed unevenly, a faint arc of polish dulled by something more human than tread. I knelt and ran my finger over the fray. The fibers bent inward. Tension once, but not for long. I stood slowly and looked out onto the stage. From here, you could almost imagine her. Rosalind, standing there in second-hand robes, voice too clear for a college production, eyes fixed somewhere just above the audience's line. There's something painfully permanent about the way certain people stand when they believe they're finally being seen. Lewis arrived an hour later. He'd been to the registrar's office, digging. She had in fact been a student of theatre, performed in The Duchess of Malfi, Twelfth Night, and something experimental I didn't recognize. Her reviews in the college paper had been kind, promising even, but she hadn't performed after March 1976. I asked for the date of her last role. He handed me a torn program. She had played Helen of Troy. I thought of the line I'd overheard from that student rehearsal. Was this the face that launched 1,000 ships? I thanked Lewis, told him I needed to speak with Lee. Alone. I found him in the costume loft, sorting through boxes he claimed had been mistagged. He didn't look surprised to see me. That was the thing about Lee. He always arrived halfway into the scene already knowing the cues. He watched me closely as I laid it out. The file, the photograph, the rope. He didn't blink. She loved me, he said. I didn't love her. She thought I did. Or maybe she just needed someone to hold on to. I was flattered, of course. Who wouldn't be? He paused, not for effect, but because some truths only land when whispered internally first. She threatened to tell the college I'd taken advantage. She wouldn't have, I think. Not really. But Vale panicked. He asked me what I wanted to do. I said nothing. So he did nothing. The night she died, he said, she came to the theater, crying. Something had changed. Maybe she'd realized I wasn't going to rescue her. Or maybe she just wanted to make someone else feel the same kind of abandonment. I asked if he pushed her. No, he said. But I didn't follow her. Didn't stop her. She slipped. She let go. Vale saw her later that night. I don't know what she told him, but something in him collapsed. He stopped showing up, stopped writing. The lodge became a cell he chose for himself. You knew. Of course I knew. But knowing isn't the same as acting. Is it, Inspector? Number. It isn't. I left without asking more. Outside, the air had shifted. Rain, maybe, or just the anticipation of it. I stood in the doorway and looked back once at the rope. Still there. Still waiting for its next roll. Penance doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's a cup left too clean, a poem written in code, a man who smiles before the fire begins. Vale hadn't died by accident. He'd orchestrated the final scene, not for justice, for release. And the curtain, finally, had fallen. It was still raining when I returned to the quad, though not with any conviction, the kind of English drizzle that arrives without decision, soft and continuous, like an afterthought that had lingered too long. I didn't open my umbrella. I sat instead on the worn stone bench beneath the south cloister, coat gathering water like moss, hands deep in pockets. The rain made the flagstones darken unevenly, spreading blotches like old gilt. Across the courtyard, the chapel bell gave a single, fractured note. Not a chime, not even a toll, just a sound that had once been a sound. It had cracked, they said, in the summer of '76, during the heat wave, during the drowning. Some blamed metal fatigue, others blamed divine punctuation. Since then it rang only in echoes, and even those were reluctant. The college was quiet. Too quiet for a place that believed in tradition and the elegant denial of consequence. Lee would retire at the end of term. Some whispered he'd move the date forward. Others said he'd merely grown tired of pretending to mentor those who no longer believed in tragedy. I suppose he'd spent a lifetime directing scenes that never quite ended. Heron, I heard, returned to her work with increased efficiency. Her tone sharpened. Her silences lengthened. No formal charges had been filed, of course. No theft proved. The CCTV was inconclusive, and the missing file, Rosalind Kerr's, remained exactly that. Missing, perhaps incinerated, perhaps folded into the history the college preferred. I didn't blame them. Not entirely. Some institutions don't mend. They settle into their fractures and learn how to echo without resonance. The archive still smelt faintly of smoke. And Vale, Gregory Vale, had smiled before the fire, but not out of peace. Number. There was something else in that expression. A man who had borne the weight of silence for too long, whose guilt had become his identity. He hadn't died seeking forgiveness. He had died finally tired of waiting for it. I left the bench slowly, my knees reminding me that time passes whether you solve anything or not. The rain had lightened, the sky a dull pewter with no promise of change. I crossed the college gates and walked aimlessly, as I often do, until the path curved near the river. The Isis moved with its usual quiet indifference, threading through reeds and under stone bridges that had outlived too many names. I stood a while by the bank, hands behind my back, and watched as a single leaf drifted past, caught briefly in a swirl before vanishing. Water has no memory, they say. But it has repetition, the way it pulls at what's let go. I thought of her. Rosalind, the bruised temple, the wet hair, the silence, and then the rope, always the rope. Justice, I realized, is rarely fire. It's forgetting, or being forgotten, or carrying a memory that no one else wants to share. I reached for my cigarette case. The lighter clicked twice, then stayed quiet. I held the cigarette between my fingers for a moment, not lighting it, just holding. A gesture more than an act. Smoke wouldn't have made anything clearer. Somewhere behind me, the bells of another college marked the hour. Even they sounded tired. I turned back toward the road, walking slowly, deliberately. My shoes tapped softly against the wet pavement, a sound that belonged only to the present. Oxford exhaled its fog and said nothing.